Welcome back. Now that we looked at interfaces a little bit, I would say let's go back to our MVVM counter. So we have built the MVVM and we had the view model, but we didn't really have the model yet. So the thing is, with our super simple example, a model would be a little off, but still I want to explain it to you with this very basic example, because otherwise MVVM can really be a little difficult to get. So what do we need to do? Well, let's go ahead and instead of just having our counter view model and our main activity, let's have another class that will be our model itself. Okay, so I'm going to call this one counter model. Okay, so you have this model keyword for the name. It's quite important. So now we have the model, the view model, and the main activity contains the view. So it would be M model, V view, main activity, and view model. That's what this MVVM stands for. So what does this counter model look like? Well, counter model really is just a data class. Very simple. And therefore it needs to have parameters. So I can just have a parameter, which will be the count of type int. And that is already it. So our model is very simple, as I said. That's why it wouldn't really make sense to use this complex MVVM structure if you ever were to build a counter application like we did. And we saw how easy it was just using the logic inside of the UI, so to speak, or in the main activity. But I still want to show you this example because otherwise, as I said, it could go over your head. So we have our model, and this model could be significantly more complex. It could have all kinds of additional information. So in our case, it just contains a number, nothing else, just a counter. And then we are going to set up our counter repository. Now, a repository is a design pattern that acts as a clean API, which stands for Application Programming Interface, for data access to the rest of the application. Think of it as a mediator between data sources such as remote APIs, local databases, and in-memory caches. So basically we're building a little tool that allows us to handle the data no matter from where it comes. So basically it's like plug and play, right? Plug in no matter from where you come. Does the data come from an interface, an API basically somewhere in the cloud, from a website? Does it come from a database that we have on the phone? Does it come from a simple, basically a simple variable of type list or so? And our repository that we're going to set up is going to be the mediator, basically the converter that converts data coming in and understanding how this data comes in and then converts it into what our application can work with. So how could such a mediator look like? Well, it's going to be inside of our counter model class. I'm going to set up the counter repository. And what it does is it has the private var counter, which is going to use our counter model and assign 0 to it. So our, not counter, but counter, like so. Our counter is just going to be a private variable of type counter model, so basically of our model type. Now we have a function that gets us the counter. So whenever we want to access the counter, we just need to call this function get counter on our counter repository, and that will just give us the counter. So you see again, this counter is hidden, so saved behind the private keyword. And now if you want to access it, you need to access it here. And then we have the increment counter, which is this function that will just increment the counter, that count variable by 1, which is this count variable here. And then we need to do the same thing with decrement counter. So another function here, which will be decrement counter, and this will do minus. So the thing that we earlier just did in our view model is what we now do inside of our counter model and inside of the specifically counter repository. So we added an additional layer, so to speak. Now, the idea behind this is that now we can really separate the logic. So the data is all managed inside of the counter repositories, how the data should be managed, the whole data logic, so to speak. Now we need to make changes to our counter view model, because our counter view model now needs to have our repository of type counter repository. Okay, so we pass the repository as a parameter. We set up our counter view model to have a property of type counter repository, which I'm going to call repository. So how does that now change our code inside here? It changes it a little bit, but not too crazily. So count now is not going to be a mutable state of just 0, but instead the repository dot get counter dot count. So it will basically use get counter to give us the counter, and the counter is our model. So this data class model, so it's an object, right? So counter model is an object, and an object has properties, and the property that we want to access is count. So that's what we're doing here. We're saying use the repository, which is using our counter repository, which is this thing here that is basically shielding, hiding our data, and we can only access it through the right channels, which is this here. So then we get the count, and our underscore count, our view model underscore private count will now be inside of our counter. Let me see. Yeah, this one should also be, by the way, underscored. Okay, I said it earlier, and we need to really follow the style here as well. So why is this not happy? Counter dot count. Okay, sometimes the IDE does its thing. Does its thing. Okay, now let's look back at our counter view model. Now instead of doing the logic directly here where we increment, we are using the repository increment counter function, and we are setting our private variable that we have inside of our view model. We're setting that value to be repository.getCounter.count. And for the increment, we do the same thing. So here, instead of implementing the logic directly here, we are using the decrement counter, and then we can go from there. And while finishing the recording for this video, I realized that doing it with this counter repository as the parameter for our counter view model would be the way if we want to make it super extendable later on. But for the simplicity of this part of the course where we're currently at, I'm just going to use this as a variable directly inside of our counter view model. Okay, so this will be our repository that I'm going to be of type counter repository. And now let's rename this. So right click and then refactor, and then there is this rename function. So it's up here, rename, and I'm going to add an underscore at the beginning because now it's a private variable inside of our counter view model. So this line basically saves us a lot of time that we would otherwise have to either create a view model factory and all of that stuff, really crazy stuff, or we would have to actually have a external resource that gives us the repository that we should work with. Okay, and we're going to see what a repository is with an analogy in the next video a little better. I'm going to show you what that does a little better. But for now, let's just run our application and see if it still works, because that's always the thing when you're refactoring your code, basically making it more readable, or like adjustable, readable, more let's say ready to work on and in a big project. You need to test it every now and then whether it still actually works. And running it, we can see that it still works. Let me turn it around and see if count exists still as 3. Yes, it does. So our code still pretty much does the same thing. You see, we didn't touch anything in the main activity. We didn't have to do anything there. Everything stayed pretty much the same. But what we did do is we adjusted our counter view model to take our counter model, so the data, the M inside of MVVM, into account. So this M is now taking care of the logic. This counter view model is now taking care of the communication using a repository of our type counter repository, which we set up inside of our counter model. Okay, so this counter repository is basically going to take care of buying the ingredients for our kitchen as we are a chef. And the analogy for that you will see in the next video, and then this will hopefully start to make a lot more sense. So see you there.